I'm grateful for the invitation, by the way. So thank you. It's nice
Well,
to.
I'm
Yeah.
even maybe well, we're not competing here, but I'm very grateful that you agree because I've met a lot of people over the course of my lifetime that I have a singular respect for because they are singular figures in the world that they live in, and I see you as one of those people.
Well, thank you. That's kind.
Okay, here we're going to start.
Okay.
Hello, everyone. This is Ed Breniger, and welcome to the Eddie Network Podcast. My guest today is Philip Bess, an architect, an academic, and a real positive thinker about many things having to do with the built environment. How about that for an introduction, Philip?
I'll try to live up to it.
I haven't said really about anything other than you're an architect, but tell us about who you are and what you've done during the course of your career and maybe what you're interested in now, what captures
Wow.
your fancy.
Sure. Well, let's see. I should say I'm educated as an architect. I worked in architectural offices. I work with architects. I'm not a licensed architect, and I think part of that is because my interests include architecture, but I came to realize while practicing architecture out of architecture school that uh, there weren't it was really difficult to figure out a way to do architecture that made cities that I thought were worth living in. And I actually, it turns out I've been thinking recently about in at Notre Dame and other places where I teach, and the Congress for the New Urbanism, and groups that I've been involved in. We talk about urbanism, and urbanism is a kind of really, I think, a difficult word. I think particularly for lay people
Mhm.
to understand, because the word urban carries negative kinds of connotations. We think of those as relatively recent, but they kind of date back from the Industrial Revolution, and all the effects of the Industrial Revolution on traditional cities. But so I've tried to figure out a better word for it, and I'm not sure that I have a better word for it. So what I want to say about urbanism, the way that I understand it, it is that it is a commitment to um, living in communities of a certain size that uh, can take a range of sizes. They can be at the scale of a hamlet or a village or a town or a big city. But in the context of a big city, it's typically in the form of a neighborhood, so that neighborhoods have a lot more in common with towns and villages, and that what's characteristic of all of them is that as a way of living is that they're relatively compact, that there's I want to say there are a variety of uses, a variety of activities that take place within that compact settlement. It's a mix of uses. So it goes completely contrary to single-use zoned kinds of settlements, which is what we've been making since the end of the Second World War. And so, to some extent, my career uh, has been um, figuring that out. It was not really we in architecture school. I would say the good news about my architectural education was that um, I was taught by people who had an interest in urbanism, understood as a certain kind of physical form.
Mhm.
But I don't. But I came to the study of it from uh, an undergraduate degree in philosophy and an academic master's degree in church history. And so I had a kind of philosophical and anthropological and religious understanding of what these things were, but I didn't have a voc. And I also had lived in an urban neighborhood for about 5 years. I grew up in the suburbs, and uh, turns out that I actually went to college in a town that was a pre-1945 town, and I lived within walking distance of the campus, and I lived in a coach house for a couple of years. So I had experiences of those kinds of things before I had any idea what their significance was, or any idea of a kind of theoretical understanding of what cities are, um, and city neighborhoods. But then the real transformation in all of that was when uh, I'd grown up I'd grown up on the West Coast. I was born in suburban Chicago, in a railroad suburb of Chicago, but had moved to California when I was 6. So I'd grown up in Southern California, went to college there, and then I went all the way across the country to do a master's degree at the Harvard Divinity School. And when I first arrived in Cambridge, uh, I was very uncomfortable with the density of it, and it took me about a semester to get accustomed to it. And then I actually left at the end of my first academic year. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, and I went and I lived in Western Massachusetts, in Amherst, Massachusetts, which is a wonderful historic small town. And in the course of that year, decided that I wanted to go to architecture school. Although I knew nothing about it, I knew nothing about the culture of architecture. Um, but before I did that, I wanted to go back to Harvard and to finish go one more year and get an academic master's degree in church history. And so that's what I did. But I also started taking architectural classes at the Boston Architectural Center that year that I was there. And then I met the woman that I was married to for 46 years, who passed away in 2020. And so we lived in Cambridge for the next 3 years. So I had 5 years in New England, 4 of them in basically Boston, and a year in Amherst, a small town. And from the time that I left Amherst and came back to Cambridge, I was completely comfortable in Cambridge. Didn't have a car, um, just really, really liked the culture. And so when I went to architecture school, I was prepared. I didn't have to be convinced of the merits of urban life,
Mhm.
that because I had experienced it, but I didn't have a language in which to think about it. And I walked into my 3-year master's program at the University of Virginia, completely ignorant of the culture of architecture. It turned out that I walked into a modernist program, which is what most schools of architecture are, but there are different kinds of modernisms. And mine was this was in the late 1970s. I think I started in the summer of 1978, and it was a program that was essentially Corbusian in its foundational assumptions about modernism and modern architecture, but it was also at the really at the there was a rising tide of um, criticism of modernism as an idea that came to be known as architectural postmodernism, but it is such a broad term. It's really hard to characterize it accurately, except insofar as it represented a kind of personal approach to architecture that kind of rejected notions of historic architectural teleology, which is a kind of fancy way of saying that um, prior to the modernist movement, I think that architecture and cities together were understood as being part of a sacred cosmos, and that part of that sacred cosmos was um, that actually the built environment is a kind of microcosm, and I had an intuition about this, but I think the theorist at the time whose work is most germane, and I didn't realize at the time, is Mircea Eliade, who is a historian of religion at the University of Chicago. And in fact, the first book that we read in the first architecture class that I took was his book, The Sacred and the Profane,
Mhm.
which in which I learned in that context that in architecture school you're assigned books to read, but you never discuss them. And so I think the assumption was we would just read it, or maybe that we wouldn't read it because we were too busy in studio to read, but that we would read it and that its import would be self-evident. And And I had kind of questions about that. I didn't really make the connections, but in retrospect, there's a lot of things that I was kind of a tough architecture student because I was suspicious of my teachers, because I realized that they were teaching me philosophy, and that I had
Mhm.
actually sort of formed counter opinions about that, but I had no idea of how to integrate that with architecture, and so I kind of mistrusted them to I don't want to say to my detriment, but it took me longer time to learn to appreciate the architectural lessons that they were teaching because they were being presented in this different kind of metaphysic. I think that I still think was flawed, but it didn't mean that their architectural ideas were entirely flawed.
Mhm.
So I still think that they were flawed in certain important respects. Anyway, it took me, I was a bad student, because I didn't trust my teachers, which I think that has kind of stayed with me as an idea as I um, transitioned from professional life into academic life of
Should
being a teacher.
shouldn't a shouldn't a professor earn the trust of his students?
Absolutely. No, no, no. Let's see. It, I won't say it's not a catch-22. It's a reciprocal thing.
Yes,
It's like
yes.
there's a positive feedback loop and a negative feedback loop. And for the positive thing to work is that students have to trust their teachers, and their teachers have to be trustworthy. And
Well,
so I took it as a teacher. I always took it as important because I didn't trust my teachers. I took it as important and take it still as important to articulate what my assumptions are and to make arguments for what I'm doing, to let them know sort of the what I understand to be the purpose of their education, which was never really explained to me in architecture school. And it doesn't mean that there wasn't a purpose. It just means that it was assumed and never articulated, and it left students puzzled all the time. And so I think that was a problem. I mean, I have classmates who came out of that more or less just fine. Although I realize in talking to them, I'm still an outlier, I think, with respect to my
well,
architectural interests. But anyway, I'm starting to wander.
no,
So
no, no, you're not wandering because I think what you're describing to us is how architecture is just one segment of a host of segments where a much broader philosophical system or tradition is being thrust upon it. And the way I would describe it in, say, in architecture terms, is that form and aesthetics trump the function of the building or the community. And so what they look like, I'm kind of working off the Brutalist film as a way of understanding that, and
sure.
and that these bits of architecture are statements of identity thrust into the realm of the world of the social, and that's what they're for. That they're in that sense, they're most of them are kind of like vanity projects in a sense.
Yeah, no, no. So I have let's see, over the years I have developed a kind of succinct three succinct laws. Well, maybe they're not that succinct, but sort of three laws. I won't share them all. Laws about architecture and urbanism, but the first one is that all architecture uh, represents power and
Uh-huh.
uh, and qualification and aspires to legitimacy, right? So that when I say it represents power, it means that it requires ability, can do, combination of skill and patronage and financial resources and all those things to make something at whatever kind of human artifact it is. And architecture is one of those kinds of artifacts, and it's a complex artifact, and there's many players involved in it. But when you actually make a work of architecture, or even just a building, but we'll say a higher notion of what architecture is, it represents power. And my point about what architecture does is that the people who commission it, they're powerful people generally, and they're interested in more than power. They want legitimacy. They want the architecture to represent their view of the world. And I think that that's true at whatever scale, whether the purpose and I think purpose is a much better word than function. Various people are attributed to the phrase "form follows function," which I think is not accurate.
I
It's
agree.
that it's the form follows purpose, and use or function is part of it, or historically has been part of it. To some extent, increasingly in the kind of architectural world we live in, use is secondary or tertiary to other kinds of things. But in classicism, which is one reason why I'm a kind of classicist fellow traveler, though I'm yeah I'm in favor of teaching classicism, but I also think that things need to be related to regional
Hmm.
resources, which classicism is very good at doing. I'll add.
I
Anyway,
agree.
the point is that that purpose is something that's much larger. And in classicism, classicism has the merit of having a kind of authoritative characterization of the art of building that really touches all the kind of practical sense bases, which goes back to Vitruvius, who's the author of the oldest treatise that we have from classical antiquity. Presumably there were others, but that's the one that we have, in which he characterized the art of building as being characterized by a concern for durability, for usefulness, and for beauty. And there was a fourth that exhibit decorum, and the notion of decorum means that these buildings are, uh, let's see, they have the kind of proper expression within a community and a variety of buildings that is hierarchical in nature, so that you understand that in a city, some buildings are more important than other buildings. And whether you're designing a less important building or a more important building, if you're a classical architect, you're designing it with this sense of decorum, so that you don't want to make a house look more important than a cathedral. You don't want to make a cathedral. It's the yeah. You don't want to make a cathedral look not beautiful and not significant and not well located. All those kinds of things. But classicism has that. Those are all. I think of those things for most lay people. That's kind of common sense stuff. I mean, if you say that architecture should be concerned with durability, it should be concerned with usefulness, it should be beautiful, and it should be in right relationship to other buildings, people would say, yeah, yeah, yeah. And then you say, well, 99% of the architecture schools do not teach that and do not think that. And that's when things get a little crazy, and you need to start making kinds of distinctions that I've always been interested in trying to make from the moment that I guess that I arrived in architecture school, but then particularly after I got out of architecture school and started working in the profession and realized um, that these were not guiding principles, and that what was needed was a different way and formulation of thinking about cities. That I again I had an intuition that this was historic, that this in fact was the way in which human beings had been thinking about cities, but that has changed. And so that's been a 40-year process of looking at history and trying to understand things from a philosophical point of view, but also just really from a historic point of view of the way in which cities today, the way in which cities today have been affected by the Industrial Revolution since about the middle of the 18th century. And of course, there were antecedents to that led up to that, but that has led us to a place where urbanism is, I mean, urbanism is an idea, and I should come back to what I mean by urbanism. When I say that I'm an urbanist, what I mean is that I think that these kinds of traditional human settlements that exist across a variety of densities, uh, from big cities to small towns, that they share a certain set of formal order principles, that they're spatial in character, they have a mix of uses, all of those kinds of things, and that those things are actually the 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 best way for most human beings to live. is to live in one of those kinds of settlements. But now, so the problem with urbanism is that you say you're an urbanist, and someone says, "Oh, well, you can't raise children in the cities. You can't do this, you can't do that. They're corrupt. They're too far from nature." With nature understood in a very kind of romantic sort of way, meaning greens, forests, and
Colic setting. Yeah.
yeah, bucolic settings where
Yeah.
uh, there are no polar bears that eat caribou or threatening you. So it's not really it's not a I think really a well considered understanding of what nature actually is. Since so the part of the argument, and so actually I should say that all of this really led me back. Didn't lead me back, but I discovered in rereading Aristotle, that Aristotle's notions of what a polis is and what a polis is for, and also the physical characteristics of a polis, are actually very proximate to what the kind of the physical forms of human settlements prior to the Industrial Revolution, and also the kinds of physical forms that are models for neo-traditional movements like the Congress for the New Urbanism. But what I found is that and it's not really surprising, it's disappointing only because it's not the world we live in. So you have to kind of question certain default suppositions about about reality to get a handle on the idea that the formal order of human settlements that neo-traditionalists like actually grew out of traditions, right? And so that if you lack the traditions, and by tradition I mean not just a certain tradition and culture of building, but a certain human culture that understands human beings as being social animals, that values communal belonging as well as individual liberty, that has all those kinds of nuances, that has highly developed divisions of labor and institutions that find a proper place within these compact communities. That is like a historic achievement, but it's not the way that we think of cities now. We think of cities in terms of, I would say, fragments of what cities are. So that, when Aristotle writes in book 7 of the Politics, about the characteristics of a good city, and he doesn't mean by this he doesn't mean an ideal city in a Platonist sense. So he's not writing the Republic. He's writing about, because he was an empiricist, and he says, well, we look at all these cities and we understand that they exist for promoting the best life that human beings can live. In that context, what their understanding of what the good life was, a life of moral and intellectual virtue lived in community with others, and most particularly in a polis. That when he talks about the polis, he talks about its physical form, but he talks about its population. In fact, the physical form and the population are what he refers to as the material causes of cities. They're what cities are made out of. But then a city is also, it's an environmental order. It's how the human animal occupies the landscape. It's an economic order. It's a place of production and exchange. It's a moral order that finds expression in the character ideal of the community in two ways: in the character ideal of the community and in the laws of the community. That represents the moral order. It's a formal order, which is the thing that architects and that we're most concerned about, how that relates, and that prior to the Industrial Revolution, all these things existed in a context of sacred order. And so maybe this takes us back to Mircea Eliade, that Eliade talks about how the notion of things in sacred order, that they scale, right, and that they're microcosms, right, and he takes just the example of ancient Israel, that the land that they occupied was a microcosm of sacred order, that the city that they occupied was a microcosm of sacred order, that the temple within the city was a microcosm, that the altar in the temple was a microcosm, that in your private life, right, the artifacts that you have in your home are another scale down of this representation of that acknowledge that you live in sacred order, and it scales, and it's always, as Eliade says, it's always a center. right? And that is absolutely lacking any contemporary modernist or postmodernist thinking of the city. I mean, we talk about making spaces in the city. I should say neo-traditionalists talk about making spaces in the city. The most of the rest of architectural education doesn't talk about making these kinds of spaces at all. But even those of us, even the neo-traditionalists who want to make these kinds of spaces, don't we see them? We justify them in practical terms, which you can do because they're very practical. But they're historically they're more than that. They're motivated by more than that. So anyway, those are my interests, and um,
Well, I
and
share a lot of that with you. Are you familiar with Edward Shill's center and periphery idea?
I'm not familiar with it, but I have an intuitive. I mean, I'd love to,
Well,
tell me.
I mean, he wrote an essay that appeared in a festschrift for Michael Poliani back in the early 60s. And he talks about the center of society being where the power resides. And those people represent the value system of the whole. And the periphery are the people who look to the center for guidance and for strength and for protection and that sort of thing, which is a very classical kind of view of cities or society or whatever it may be. And I really liked what he has to say because it's like a picture. You know, you can hold this picture up and says, "Is this what we have?" And we don't have that. And why is it that we don't have a strong relationship between the center and the periphery? And I would say he goes to something you mentioned, which is that there is this question of power, and power has become far more the goal of whatever it is. And what I have identified, and I've written quite a bit on this idea of center periphery, is that when the center abandons the periphery breaks off into their little, we can use the term neighborhoods, and they form their own centers and they take care of themselves. And I see this in small towns all over the country and everywhere I've gone. And so out of that then comes some way for a networking effect to begin to take place, which then possibly a generation or more later will have reestablished the center as something which holds the whole together.
Yeah, so I mean, new centers I think are being created all the time,
Yeah,
historically, and that this is one of those differences between post 1945 human settlements and pre-modern or pre 1945. Because I want to say I mean, things that were done in the City Beautiful movement in between 1880 and 1940. Um, Obviously, that was all taking place in the context of a culture that had become and was financed by, become highly industrialized and
right.
was financed. There were great work that was financed by great wealth, and it wasn't until, but it was still it was a modern industrial context, which didn't really start to affect the built environment until after in America until after World War II. There were modernism was more it was more of a European thing after World War One, especially. But they're related, and so but yeah, it's
So
the
what I see is, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but when we met 25 years ago, and we were at a Congress for New Urbanism conference down in Seaside, Florida, what I saw there was, and I didn't have the language at that point to describe what I'm seeing, but I saw the Congress of New Urbanism as kind of trying to reestablish a center to urban life, which is human based or human. Um, it was more focused on human flourishing and how people could live together, and I'm curious as to how you see that movement and where it is today.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember the conference because I had the title of my talk. You reminded me was called "Design and Happiness," and but that wasn't the theme.
No,
Of,
it was.
it was design and something, and it was can design make us good? Can design make us? I don't know, but it was something
It had a kind of a Aristotelian
permanent.
premise to it. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, but there was a kind of a determined. I think the way that the theme was presented to me, because I was asked to speak on a theme, and the way that it was presented was oh, I know, is can design cause happiness?
Yes, yes, that's
And I was disputing that, because I was saying that I think that design can facilitate happiness, but it's as often the case that again, it's reciprocal, uh, well, it's we're getting into traditions, I think it had a whiff about it that I was trying to uh, sort of discuss, of a modernist notion that good design will make us good. And I think that clearly anthropologically that's wrong. And this is one of those things where, like I think it was might have been Chesterton who said that our fallen nature, original sin, is sort of the only doctrine from Scripture that's empirically available to us even now. And
very
I
true.
think there's a lot of truth to that. And so the question, I was just suggesting that it was more of a discussion about what happiness is in this Aristotelian context, that it involves not simply designers creating an environment for human beings and transforming them. It's that because that doesn't treat human beings as agents. I think that's the big temptation of designers, is to not recognize that the people for whom we build are agents, and that in any so I mean, all architects recognize that when they're working with a client, that they have to do things that satisfy the client or it won't happen. But I think that there's a larger and fallacious assumption that if we can design things right, that people will be happy about it
Right.
because we're such great designers. And I think it just doesn't quite work that way. I think that you're much more likely to get, as used to be the case, that designers who work mostly in the context of communities as members of communities have a better chance of making things that are beautiful and are applauded by the community of which they're part, if they're genuinely part of the community. And I think that one of the problems with modern society is that architects are too often not really uh, parts of communities in the way, at least as an ideal. We tend, or have tended, to lionize form givers, right?
Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, as if architects are a kind of, small g god. And I just that's not that just seems to be untrue to our human condition, our anthropological condition. So.
Well, I see that we're trapped in a in a period of time where form is really the preeminent thing. And I mean, the old thing of form follows function is not true. The form determines what the function is. That's what I found as a consultant. You're walking into a group, and there was never any question about, well, we need to change how we're organized in order to achieve what we need to. No, we're going to try to figure out how to make it work within the confines of what we have. And time and time again, I saw that that was just a failed premise that they had, that they couldn't change their structure. And I keep asking that question because I think there is somehow a loss of confidence is too simple a word, but there's a loss of some aspect of our humanity when we cannot design, create, or even co-create the forms that we need to achieve the goals and the mission and the purposes that we have in life.
Well, yes, I think that that's true. Very few of us make our own buildings, make our own houses. We don't. I mean, the thing about local cultures of building is that they were employing resources that were locally available and making things out of what was to hand. And it's characteristic of the modern world and of a global culture that our building materials come from all over. They're made out of all kinds of things that have, um, maybe questionable environmental effects on both in their manufacture and in their transportation. But certainly in terms of yielding places that are distinctly local, right? That
Yeah.
really have a local vernacular. That and that this happened. I mean, this is such a great example of what human beings, that what the human animal does, right? That again, thinking about human settlements and thinking about traditional towns, cities, neighborhoods as being the way that the primary way that the human animal occupies the landscape. We make that out of the materials that we find. And prior to the existence of mechanized transportation, which is in many ways a kind of good, in many ways is a good, but it also has consequences, unintended consequences that need to be thought through, and there need to be limits, I would say, placed upon um, those kinds of consequences. But when we were making these kinds of settlements that we all love to visit on vacation, right? These were things that were built largely originally under conditions of scarcity. And the interesting thing is that by using these local materials at hand, human animals fashion, our artisans fashion places that are beautiful, that have within them the kinds of resources that they need, proximate to an agrarian landscape, that create environments with a kind of density where you put within pedestrian proximity all these different kinds of uses and goods that are both produced and exchanged. That, in other words, you have an economy, all of this kind of thing. That is how, under conditions of scarcity for human beings, the human beings created wealth, right? They created wealthy environments, and that's all become much, well, not just much more abstract. It's become almost entirely abstract, and it's part of an abstract modern economy that really um, is problematic in its effects, and I think not ultimately sustainable, economically sustainable, especially, but even in an important way, not environmentally the best form of human stewardship.
I met a guy a couple of weeks ago he's probably in his early 80s, and he's a friend of friends of mine. And kind of back last year or 2 years ago, really, it will be 2 years next month. I moved back to my hometown after being gone for 53 years.
Hmm.
And I bought a 115-year-old house downtown. Um, it's a beautiful house that needs a lot of work. And whether that ever happens is another story. But it's a classic large house, 5 bedrooms with high ceilings, and it's a place that I can socialize when I want to. So I'm back in my hometown, and I'm trying to adjust. And I meet this guy, and I said, "So what did you do for your career?" And he says, "Well, I had a furniture company." And I said, "Well, what did you make?" He says, I made the furniture that nobody wants now." I said, "Well, what's that?" He says, "Dark brown traditional furniture." Ah, so you're not making contemporary Scandinavian influenced furniture. He says, "No, I've made the stuff that your grandparents used to have in their house." I said, "Well, I like that stuff, and it's hard to find it." He says, "Yeah, it doesn't, not too much of that is made any longer." So, and that's because what's the furniture that's presented to us is brought in from elsewhere, and you have to go to a used furniture shop to find the old stuff that actually you want
Yeah.
to have in you.
Well, I hope he's doing well. I mean, I think that's a great project. It's the kind of thing that if
Well,
you make a living at it, it's a really nice way to make a living.
Well, it's been interesting being back here because it's my first time living in an urban environment since the mid 80s.
Hmm.
And I moved into this house, and within 2 months, I had how do I describe this? Across the street is a little tiny house in one of those classic prefab tiny houses that were bought and put on a slab. And the guy that was living there got kind of taken over by a drug gang. And I could sit in from my front room and watch the drama of The Wire unfold
Wow.
across the street from me.
Yeah.
And then the house that's behind me, that's the same thing happened. And it went on for 2 or 3 months, and then something happened, and the landlords ran them out or something, or the sheriff came and took the squatters out. But now there's no one behind me, and there's an older gentleman and his four dogs living across the street, and so it's a much more peaceful place. But it was interesting to see the underground economy of the city
Yeah.
at work, and it's not just drug dealing, it's not just drug purchasing, it's sex work and all those different things going on. And I didn't choose that, but I also didn't seek to try to fix it.
How large? I'm just curious. How, without telling me the city, how large a town?
I think it's about 250,000.
Okay, all right. So it's a metropolis of
Yeah,
sorts. So it's a city with neighborhoods.
yeah.
But yeah,
But
because
but the thing which you will appreciate more than anything, I'm a 5 minute walk to the minor league baseball park.
that's very important.
It is. It is. So, well, let me ask you to tell us a little bit about how neighborhoods should function, because I don't think people understand that. Because what I find is that there's a lot of suspicion in neighborhoods because neighborhoods are increasingly are places of diversity.
Yeah.
And I keep saying, if you want to be a person of impact, just go knock on your neighbor's door and say, "Hey, can we have a cup of coffee? Have conversations." Just start to do that. So let's talk a little bit about neighborhoods and how we can make them work better for us.
Um, well, let's see. So let me share uh, a diagram. So this has been a really difficult year, 2025, in terms of sort of great people passing. Alistair McIntyre passed earlier this year, and big influence on me. But Leon Creer also
Yeah. Mhm.
died. I think it was last June, and then also a lot of name architects. Just recently, Robert Stern passed away, and Frank Gehry passed away, and but I have a favorite. Leon Creer was, actually as important to me as anybody with respect to thinking about urban form and the form of cities and neighborhoods and their characteristics. And two diagrams in particular, one that just shows that just makes a distinction between private buildings and that occupy blocks and that define streets, and that are kind of background buildings, but they're houses and housing and mixed use shops and things like that, low rise kind of
You
stuff
want
to
me
do.
to set up so you can share that?
No, 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 because I just I don't it would take
Okay.
us a little too long. But and then the other diagram is a diagram of all of the individual um, unique what traditional urbanists call foreground buildings. So that all have a kind of unique form, even though they're recognizable types. So you recognize the church and you recognize the library and courthouse and temple and things like that, and that those are buildings that are meant to stand out, right? And
Right.
they're architectures, but and that he identifies one is the public realm, which is those buildings, and the other is the private realm, which are the background building, and that he combines the two drawings together, and you get the realm that he calls the city, right? Which is The city is made up of all of those kinds of things together, and they define public spaces, and there's a hierarchy, and you have access to all of the different things within the city. And again, by city, it can be the scale of a small town or a village. But so that's one diagram. But then I think the one that's even more illuminating, because it does have to do with form and the significance of what form is. And it's that he shows a diagram, he shows a pizza, and then he shows a slice of the pizza that's removed or pulled away from the whole pizza. And he says a neighborhood is to a city as a slice of pizza is to a pizza. It has essentially all the same ingredients in the slice that is in the entire pizza. And then he shows adjacent to that basically a suburban idea of the pizza, where you've got the crust here and the sauce over there and the pepperoni over here and the cheese way over there, and that to get to them you have to drive your car to them, right?
Right.
And the point is that a pizza has the form of a pizza with all these things together, and a neighborhood has the form of a city, as a microcosm of the larger form of the city, the larger pizza. Whereas the suburbia, where all these uses are separated and you have to drive to them, it lacks the form. It's not. In other words, when you put all these ingredients, all the pizza ingredients, and strew them all around, you don't have a pizza, right? And so that's kind of the problem of the form of suburbia in terms of the way we live in proximity to each other and proximity to the everyday quotidian sorts of things that we do in our lives. We shop, we go to school, we live, we play, we worship, those kinds of things. And so that's kind of the formal aspect of that. And now I fear I'm getting lost on your original question. So
No, you're addressing something that I've actually written about
okay.
because, and I think it was Christopher Alexander who had something similar to say, where it was the network which has all these discrete parts that connect, but they don't connect in an overlap way, and the lattice work, which is really the kind of thing that the pizza is a lattice work where everybody, there are all these layers, and you can move between all these different functions of a community because it's a lattice work rather than having to go cross boundaries to go to do things, because your neighborhood is your house and that's it. And then you have to cross a boundary to go to the school or a boundary to the shopping center. Where I live, I'm in 5 to 10 minutes of 8 grocery stores.
Within walking distance.
Not walking distance,
Okay. All right.
but driving distance. I mean, but that to me, I mean, I lived in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, where it took 2 hours to drive to Walmart. So that's a very different sort of thing. I can walk to my local pizza place, and that's probably the best I can do. I can walk. I can walk to other places actually, but
Yeah. Well,
but it takes time.
let me, yeah, no, well, you can walk to the baseball park, so that's important.
Uh-huh.
The and I'm not joking, actually. But
Right.
I want to go back to your question, because your question was about sort of how do we live together in neighborhoods,
Yeah.
and yeah, that is much more than the urban form. The city of Chicago is full of neighborhoods made up of the same kinds of buildings that were built at the same time, that originally had a mix of uses adjacent to them. I mean, they really were neighborhoods, and some of them are desperately poor and violent and really hard to live in and very cheap because of those reasons. And others, the same physical arrangement, are extremely valuable and extremely expensive and extremely desirable places to
Yeah.
live. So it's not just the form that determines the behavior, that it's also a matter of it's a matter of opportunity, it's a matter of character, it's a matter of functioning institutions, it's a matter of sort of larger patterns of um, larger patterns of discrimination that that where the discrimination, if it's done for reasons of race or class, is problematic, but it's also patterns of in environments and institutions, and I would say in particular families and schools that really create a network where there's a sense of obligation, right? So again, so that you understand the residents of a city, there may be more just and less just legal arrangements, but there are also the way that you respond to that is also determined a lot by character virtues and the institutions you grow up in. And some really good studies of this have been done. I'm trying to remember the name of the guy who did. There was a book in the mid-90s called The Lost City. And it was about three neighborhoods in Chicago in the 1950s and then what they were like in the mid-1990s.
Is that Kevin Lynch?
It's not Kevin Lynch. Gosh, I'm sorry. This
That's
is
all right.
a
We'll Google it.
big thing. Yeah, but it's called Alan Ehrenholt. Alan
Oh,
Ehrenholt.
okay. Yeah, I know that name.
Yeah, really great book. And he looked at uh, a kind of white ethnic Catholic parish in Chicago, an African American neighborhood, and I think it was Bronzeville, and a suburb. It was a railroad suburb. It was Elmhurst, I think that he looked at, and he looked at them what it was like in the mid '50s and what they're like in the mid '90s. And it's all very very interesting. Basically, what he's saying is in the mid '90s, there's a much more in the culture generally. There was much more of an emphasis upon individual rights and much less emphasis upon communal belonging and communal obligation. And the way that in the '50s the communal obligation took forms that we would regard today as oppressive, like because your neighbors looked after your children, right? If your children were doing something, they would let you know, and the children knew that if they were doing something, that the neighbors would let your
Yeah.
parents know. That had a kind of
I
stabilizing
grew up in
social.
that time. Yeah.
Yeah, and so, and that was it was an entirely different thing in the '90s. But there's another book that was really quite interesting related to Chicago about these things, because you're talking about in a big city, neighborhoods are always defined by boundaries. And I just think of the neighborhood that I lived in, and they're defined by boundaries in a weird way, by how you use and how you live in the neighborhood. So that I take students to Chicago for a neighborhood tour of Chicago, and one of the neighborhoods we tour is the neighborhood I used to live in Mr. Bess's neighborhood, I call it. And that neighborhood was defined, I think of it as defined by these four streets, half mile apart. It's a half mile by half mile. And the two streets, I mean, and these are like major half mile streets in Chicago, the way that Chicago is laid out. But what I point out is that that's defining it as an edge. But in fact, that the way that I lived in that neighborhood, like one of those major streets was a center for me, the way I lived, and another street just a half a block away from me or a block away from me was an edge, because I never went on the other side of that block, but on the other one, the other street, I was always doing things there. But so that people, and it might have been for my next door neighbors, it might have been exactly the opposite. That we lived on the same street, but in terms of what the neighborhood center was, we might have sort of understood the neighborhood center a little bit differently. But the thing about Royko, I'm sorry, I didn't mention Royko. I'm about to mention Mike Royko, was a great Chicago journalist who wrote
Right.
a wonderful book about the first Mayor Daley, and the title of which was Boss. And the first couple chapters of it were a description of Richard J. Daley, the neighborhood that he grew up in Bridgeport, which incidentally his family grew up in, and his son Richie, who became Mayor Daley number two, grew up in and lived in that neighborhood. So there's really a neighborhood thing in Chicago. And Royko talks about how in the '20s, Richard J. Daley was a member of like an Irish gang, right? And so the boundaries of neighborhoods were very strictly defined ethnically, so that when if you live in an Irish neighborhood, and one of these major streets in Chicago, on the other side of it, you're off your turf, right? And so it might be the Irish adjacent to the Poles or the Irish adjacent to the Italians, and you start to have rivalries and conflicts and street fights and things like that when these groups are newly arrived and newly ensconced in these neighborhoods. And God help you in those neighborhoods if you're African American, right, and out of place. And of course, that's a generational thing. And what starts to happen is that, when the Irish guy falls in love with the Polish gal and marry, right? Then all of a sudden, these people are your relatives. That's a great definition of marriage, by the way. Someone said no, it's actually a great definition of sex. That sex is nature's way of turning strangers into relatives.
I like that. Yeah.
No, it's great. It's very
It's like West Side Story.
right. Exactly. It's exactly. It's Romeo and Juliet. It's West Side Story.
Romeo and Juliet. Yeah. Yeah. That's right.
So anyway, but that's a part of the evolution of neighborhoods and neighborhood identity and city identity. And so it's I would say that these identities, there's always boundaries, but they're fluid. There is no kind of, I mean, short of the eschaton. And again, this is I think where it's helpful in some ways to have a kind of transcendent perspective on cities and what the city, the city that we're striving toward, that has these characteristics that we can kind of experience sacramentally. Like, and what I mean by experience of sacramentally, it's the kind of experience that you have anywhere, but like in any kind of urban environment where you're just having a really good time and you think, God, this must be what heaven is like, right? Or something like that when you have that feeling in an environment, which is, I think, aspirationally, to the extent that architects can have anything to do with that, that is kind of the highest aspiration that an architect could have, is to make that kind of environment where people have that experience, that it's a kind of a little glimpse of perfection. But in reality, in history, in time, it's volatile and it's changing and it's moving. And so what it seems to me that what we're trying to do as architects, properly, what we're trying to do as architects is keep moving on that trajectory, right? Where we're moving toward the best. We're moving toward this.
So my last question concerns the architecture program at Notre Dame. Tell us a little bit about that program, and I mean, you could actually pitch it to my audience, but what makes your program distinctive in the context of other programs?
Well, I'd say I'm going to say very good things about the program at Notre Dame, without suggesting that it can't be better. But I think the good things about it are that we really do we teach architecture in the context of a tradition that is understood as a living tradition. And so a living tradition is something that has you study the past to understand it and to take from its best examples, that those best examples establish a standard of excellence, and that as an architect you strive to imitate and then emulate that excellence. And when you learn to emulate, right, you are because any project that you do is oriented toward the future. That when you and presents new problems, right, that weren't available, or that weren't the same problems that had even when the things that you're emulating were being built, is that it's the new circumstances and your attempt to engage them from a point of view where you're operating with a standard of excellence, that is really what projects your work into the future. That if it's good enough, it becomes a standard of excellence, right? And
Right.
that's
Right.
and that's the aspect. So the tradition necessarily has this view to the past, but it's always forward looking. It's always teleological, addressed toward a kind of ideal, which I think, again, as a Catholic, I think is anthropologically understood as the city of God that we're drawn to in our work. But that's so Notre Dame relates to that, I think, in part, at best, in terms of taking history seriously. I think we're still working at articulating what that vision of the good life is, and there's disagreement about that, but it's a I think if you come to Notre Dame to study architecture in terms of the formal things, there will be a lot more you'll have to learn after you get out of Notre Dame, but you won't have to unlearn a lot of things, and that's the drawback of not all. There's others that have the same similar kinds of aspirations, but it seems to me that for a notion of for a notion of architecture that is more than just self-expression and novelty, that is something that if you're taught that way, you have to unlearn that in your life because life is real and it imposes
Right.
constraints and restrictions. And if you just think that you're going to come out and persuade everybody of your genius, you're going to mostly live an unhappy life unless you can um, work with others and toward a shared standard of excellence. And I would say that Notre Dame is committed to a shared standard of excellence, even if we have difficulty sometimes trying to articulate exactly what that means.
Would
But I
would
recommend it.
would would I be wrong in um, assuming that when someone comes and begins the program there, they may have a sense of wanting to be an architect but doesn't really understand that, and that when they leave, they're able to take any any architectural challenge, whether it's a new house or a commercial building or something, and they are able to apply themselves to that task because of what they learned there.
Yeah, no, that's a very good kind of summation. The only qualification I would say is that I mean the fact is that most people come to architecture school because we're Americans and we live in a highly individualistic culture and we all of the architects, the famous architects, are people who've done things that no one else has ever done, and they're lionized for that, even if their buildings are falling apart within a year and are enormously expensive to construct and maintain and environmentally problematic. All those things that the uh, that if you come to Notre Dame, students come to Notre Dame focused on buildings. But the thing that the program does best, I think, is to relate buildings to, again, environmental conditions, but even more importantly, to social and cultural traditions. And uh, that and that the foremost place for realizing those are in the context of human settlements, the urban settlements. And so the thing that happens at Notre Dame is that you come in thinking about buildings, but by the time you graduate, you're thinking about buildings in a context of other buildings and making public spaces and that are really the physical forms of community. And in the course of that happens, that doesn't happen all at once. That happens over 5 years. The middle year is really important because you're getting foundational work in the first 2 years. The third year, you go to Rome and you live in Rome and you see Rome and you see this other kind of condition, and then you come back in the final 2 years. And the experience of going to Rome in itself is a life changer because these students go over there at 19 or 20 and they have
Wow.
to live in the country and they spend a whole almost a full year. They're engaged with another culture and another language and seeing some really really good works of art and architecture and urban space. And then it's a question of synthesizing that when you come back and thinking about how do you do that in an American modern industrial economic and cultural context that is entirely different. And that is the challenge. And that's something we're still working on. But it's kind of figuring out how that translates. And I guess what I want to say is that at the end, I mean, they're totally transformed in their fifth year from what they were in their first year. They
Imagine.
come as these callow youth, and by the time they're graduating, they're dressing well, they're speaking articulately, they're making drawings of complicated projects, they're presenting them in 10 minutes to a group of professionals and then engaging their criticism. And it's an extraordinary transformation. And I'll just say that they come out of school ready to go to work in an office and make a contribution, but they still have a lot to learn, right? And it's a start. But what again, I'll underscore this thing that maybe the best thing about it is that when they graduate, they don't have to unlearn things,
Yeah.
right? They can keep on learning because the process of unlearning takes a lot of time, and I can vouch for that. So.
Wow, what a transformational experience.
It's so impressive. I think of what I was like at the age of 23 and what our graduates are like at the age of 23, and I'm just astounded.
So are any of the other departments at the university doing something similar where they take their students off for a year in Rome?
Well, yeah, we have overseas programs in different departments, but the nature of the modern university is that it has trouble with um, dealing with departments that are not oriented toward a subject in an individualist kind of way, right?
Oh,
That what is lionized is individual achievement that no one else has done, and so it's not it's not a communal environment where your own good is realized at the same time as the good of others from the result of a common enterprise. And I mean, that's just the model of a modern research university. We still have trouble, I would say the university has trouble and the school has trouble in figuring out where a school like ours fits in the context of a modern research university. But we're working at it. There's a commitment at Notre Dame, I think, from both the administration level and the School of Architecture level to try to make that happen. But I wouldn't say we've figured it out yet.
it's fascinating. It's great to reconnect with you and to hear all this stuff. And it just reinforces so much of what I've learned. I mean, you just hearing you speak 25 years ago and being around those people within the Congress of New Urbanism um, provided me a physical context for thinking about a lot of the abstract stuff that I was thinking at that point in time. And and now I look at places in a much more dynamic way. I mean, I looked at where I live in a very dynamic way, and whether I'm critical or affirming is it's a secondary thing, but it began then, and it was I'm very appreciative of what you all have done and what the work that you've done, and I appreciated your book, and um, I'm
Well,
just
thank you.
grateful that you exist.
Well, thank you, Ed. Thank you. I know we all have our work to do, I think,
Very
and
true.
I'm grateful for the invitation to be here, and grateful for the work that you do as well.
Thank you. And thank you all for watching. Let me suggest that before you walk into the next building that you're going to walk into, that you stop and look at it and just ask yourself, what do I think about this? And then go in and do whatever you have to do. Maybe a grocery store, maybe your house, maybe a church, whatever it is, just ask the question, what do I think about this place? And that will begin to help you think about the place that you live in a way that I think may be very beneficial to you and everyone that you know long term. So thank you, Philip, and thank you all for watching, and we'll see you next time here on the Eddie Network podcast. Bye bye.
Thanks, Ed.